6 things you can start doing right now to help the planet. Eat less animal products. I know how this sounds, but the truth is that, although livestock production accounts for only 18% of the global caloric supply, animal farming occupies 77% of all agricultural land, either for growing animals, growing their feed, or for grazing. Also, intensive animal farming practices require a lot of energy, from maintaining optimum temperatures to raise these animals in hot and cold climates, to refrigerating and packing and transporting these easily perishable food products. Their feed also requires a lot of land, water and fertilizers to grow, while free-range animals cause overgrazing. Add to that the fact that the extreme amounts of manure contributes to high levels of methane and nitrous oxides, while ruminant animals produce great amounts of methane from belching, all of which adds to greenhouse gas emissions. A small reduction in our animal product intake can make a huge difference globally, while pressuring farmers to implement more ethical and sustainable farming practices with healthier animals and less waste production. Cut single-use plastic. Plastic is a cheap and common byproduct of petroleum. It contributes to about 10% of all waste products, about 300 million tons each year. 50% of it is for single-use purposes and 8 million tons end up in the oceans yearly. Plastic degrades very slowly in nature. Instead, it just breaks into smaller and smaller pieces that persist in the ecosystem, and end up consumed by wildlife and humans and can accumulate inside living tissues. They are transported by oceans and winds and can be found virtually everywhere on the planet, including oceans, soils, air, freshwater, in the poles and inside human and animal bodies. Although plastic can technically be recycled, just because it is recyclable doesn't mean that it actually gets recycled, since there are many varieties of plastics, and sorting cannot be done automatically, which makes plastic recycling a very labor-intensive industry for such a cheap product. Use technology until it dies. Nobody is surprised that the more advanced technology, the more it requires harmful chemicals and heavy metals to produce these electronics, and when they end in landfills, those same heavy metals will contaminate soil, air and underground water. And it doesn't really help that a lot of these products end up dumped in some of the poorer countries in Africa and Asia, countries that are struggling with managing these wastes, and most have no laws in place to regulate these activities. And just in case you didn't care about people in those countries, some of them happen to produce a lot of food that ends up on your table. And because I can't dare telling you to throw your phone out, the next best thing you can do is to make sure you use your electronics for as long as possible. You don't need to buy a new piece of electronics just because you can. Stop supporting companies that produce obsolete technology that becomes useless after 1 year because of some upgrade, or that require you to buy specific gadgets to have access to functions that you already paid for, or companies that denies the right to repair your own product. Instead, make sure that your product can be upgraded without having to be thrown out, and that your community has a recycling program where you can safely discard your gadgets. You can also support open source technology that allows everybody to contribute, adapt and improve technology for a fairer, more accessible and sustainable use. Lower your carbon footprint. Greenhouse gases are naturally occurring in our atmosphere in trace amounts, less than 0.1%, and they are very efficient at insulating the Earth, giving it an average atmospheric temperature of 15 degrees Celsius instead of minus 18 degrees Celsius that would have been if the atmosphere didn't have those greenhouse gases. But it's that exact same efficiency makes it that the smallest changes in the amount of those gases have significant consequences on the Earth's climate, dramatically raising the average temperature of the Earth's surface. Which is what has been happening in the last few decades as we became more and more reliant on fossil fuels and industrialized animal farming, effectively emitting great quantities of these gases, mostly carbon dioxide and methane. These greenhouse gases exist at different concentrations in the atmosphere, with CO2 being the most common. They also have different potencies, or global warming potential, GWP, with methane, for example, is 25 times an average more efficient in trapping infrared energy than CO2. They also have different lifetimes in the atmosphere. The lowest is methane, which can stay in the atmosphere for around 12 years, while carbon dioxide is indestructible and its atmospheric lifetime will depend on how quickly it will be absorbed out of the atmosphere. Which can be easily achieved by planting more trees, composting as much as possible, and reducing organic waste in landfills. Be energy efficient. Choosing appliances that are certified energy efficient, LED light bulbs, and being conservative with the use of heating and air conditioning. It won't just help your bank account, but it also would greatly reduce your carbon footprint, since most of our energy comes from non-renewable sources. Another way you can conserve energy is by using public transport, carpooling, reducing your air travel, and choosing smaller and more energy-efficient cars. Sustainable consumption. Consumerism is all around us. We are bombarded by constant ads wherever we look, and pressured to look a certain way and project a certain image, so we listen to ads that make promises they can't keep so we could aspire to a lifestyle that we couldn't achieve. We live in an age where we can get cheap polyester fast fashion just so we could wear it once or twice, where we can buy poor quality gadgets all the way from China with one click, before we go to the local store to get Australian snacks to pair with French drinks. and maybe get a perfectly ripe pineapple all the way from Costa Rica, which sits next to the Mexican avocados at an unreasonably cheap price that can only be achieved through the exploitation of the resources and people of another country. Sustainable consumption is probably the best thing that we can do for the environment, supporting businesses that source their materials ethically and sustainably, use environmentally friendly energy sources and industrial practices. It is also about responsible consumerism, where we only consume what we need, occupy less spaces and waste less. It is about ensuring that we get the most of our products, by donating, repairing, repurposing and recycling them before we throw them away. And staying away from buying cheap mass-fabricated products. The most important step anyone can do towards a more sustainable living, is to consume locally. Support locally grown food from small farms that cater to the needs of the community and small businesses that tend to produce only what they can sell. They don't make huge profits that allow them to be wasteful with their raw materials, they are more involved in their communities and can provide them with products that cater to their specific needs and standards, while reducing transport and distribution. They follow environmental norms and labor laws that you are familiar with and have voted on. But also supporting local businesses keeps the money circulating in the same community, creates jobs and reduces poverty and raises the living standards. Finally and most importantly, these are guidelines and not hard and fast rules to be taken as all or nothing. You can start by implementing them gradually in your life as much as your living conditions allow.